Welcome back to Strange Epochs. I'm Sean Spainhour, and this is the show where we take one strange, true, documented moment from somewhere in the long and bewildering span of human history, and we sit with it. Really sit with it. We've been to medieval Europe twice now. We watched a woman dance herself nearly to death in the cobblestone streets of Strasbourg in 1518. We watched a dead pope sit propped on a throne in Rome, while a living one screamed at him. Dark times, faraway times, the kind of history that feels like it happened to different species of humans entirely. This week, we are coming forward, a long way forward. We are going to America. The year is 1944. The Second World War is grinding toward its conclusion. And in a small, quiet, thoroughly ordinary city in central Illinois, a city of 16,000 people, of front porches and victory gardens and church suppers, something is happening that no one can explain. People are waking up in the night, paralyzed, gasping, overwhelmed by a sweet and sickening smell that seems to come from nowhere and leave nothing behind. The symptoms resolve in 30 minutes. The smell vanishes. And in the morning, the police find no evidence that anything happened at all. The newspapers are calling him the Mad Gasser of Mattoon. Armed men are patrolling the streets after dark, looking for a thin figure in black who moves through backyards like smoke and disappears without a trace. The FBI is involved. State police are involved. Chemical warfare experts from the Army have been brought in to test the air and analyze the symptoms. And then, almost as suddenly as it started, it stops. No one is ever arrested. No gas is ever identified or recovered. No culprit is ever charged. The thin man in the dark cap is never found. But the people of Mattoon were not imagining things. Their bodies told them something real was happening. They smelled something. They couldn't move their legs. They vomited. They burned. And the question of what caused all of that, a real person with a real weapon, industrial fumes on the wind, or the collective terror of a wartime community pushed past its breaking point, has never been fully and cleanly answered. New episodes every Tuesday at 5 in the morning. Sources are always in the episode description. Let's begin. Mattoon, Illinois, the night of September 1st, 1944. It is late, past 11 o'clock. The neighborhood around Marshall Avenue is quiet, with the deep, particular quiet of a small Midwestern city at night, the kind of quiet where you can hear crickets through the window screen, the distant sound of a car on the main road, and not much else. The street is dark, the houses are dark, everyone who can be is in bed. Aline Carney is in bed. She is in her early 30s, a young mother, and she has been home alone a lot lately. Her husband Bert drives a taxi for a living and works late shifts. Tonight is one of those nights. Her sister Martha is staying over to keep her company, sleeping in another room. Aline's 3-year-old daughter, Dorothy Ellen, is asleep in the double bed beside her. The windows are open because it is still warm, the last of the summer heat. The night's not yet cool enough to close everything up, and a small intermittent breeze is moving the curtains. Aline is reading the newspaper before sleep, the way people did before television. She has the bedside light on, the sheets pulled up, the paper folded in her lap. The usual nighttime sounds of the neighborhood drift in through the window screen. Crickets, a dog somewhere, the creak of the house settling. And then she notices a smell. At first she thinks it might be the flowers from the garden outside the window, something sweet and heavy, almost floral. But it isn't quite right. There's something underneath the sweetness, something chemical, something that doesn't belong in a backyard garden on a warm night in central Illinois. She tries to place it and can't. She puts the newspaper down. She breathes in again, slower this time. And then her legs stop working. Not pain, not a cramp, nothing dramatic, just nothing. She tries to move them and they don't respond. She tries to swing her feet off the bed and sit up, and nothing happens from the waist down. Her throat is dry and tight. Her lips feel numb, slightly burning. She is not panicking yet, not quite, but she is frightened in the particular way of someone whose body is doing something bodies are not supposed to do. She calls for her sister. Martha comes in. Aline tells her what's happening. Martha doesn't smell anything unusual. She doesn't have any symptoms. She has been in a different room of the same house, just down the hall, and she is fine. She runs to a neighbor's house and asks them to call the police. When Bert Carney arrives home at midnight, the police have already come and gone. They found nothing, no gas, no chemical residue, no evidence of anything, but they took a report. Bert goes around to the side of the house to check the bedroom window from outside, and he sees something, a figure, standing in the shadows near the window. Tall, thin, dark clothing, a tight-fitting cap on the head. The figure moves. Bert gives chase. He doesn't catch it. By morning, Aline's paralysis has resolved. Her legs work, her lips are normal. She is shaken but not seriously injured. The police investigation finds nothing, no gas, no chemical residue, no signs of tampering at the window, nothing beyond one frightened woman's symptoms, and one man's brief glimpse of a figure in the dark. The next morning, the Mattoon Daily Journal-Gazette runs a story on the front page. The headline reads, "Anesthetic Prowler on Loose." And with those 4 words, something is born. Something that will grip the city of Mattoon for the next 2 weeks, filling the streets with armed men hunting a ghost, drawing in the FBI and the Army and state police from across Illinois, and leaving behind a mystery that has never been fully resolved. The Mad Gasser of Mattoon. Act 1. The world that made this possible. To understand the Mad Gasser, you have to understand what Mattoon was and what America felt like in the late summer of 1944. Because this event did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in a specific place, at a specific moment in history, to specific kinds of people under specific kinds of pressure. That context is not just background. It is the story. Mattoon was, and still is, a small city in east central Illinois, about halfway between Chicago and St. Louis, set in the flat agricultural heartland of the state. In 1944, its population stood around 16,000 people. It was a railroad town, a market town, the kind of place where the downtown had a Sears and a Woolworths and a movie theater that changed its double feature every few days, where the neighborhoods were laid out in modest grids of wood frame houses with front porches and backyard vegetable gardens. People knew their neighbors. They left their doors unlocked. They left their windows open on warm nights without giving it a second thought. It was, in almost every visible way, ordinary. But the war had reached it. The war had reached everywhere in America. By 1944, there was no community untouched by it. But in a city the size of Mattoon, with a population small enough that everybody knew somebody in the service, the absence was felt personally and constantly. The young men were gone. The husbands and brothers and sons were in Europe, where the Normandy landings had taken place 3 months earlier, and the Allied forces were pushing east through France. They were in the Pacific, fighting through islands whose names their families had never heard before the war and would never forget afterward. The women who remained were holding everything together. They were working in factories that had converted to war production. They were managing households alone, raising children on rationed food and rationed gasoline, handling finances that their husbands had always handled, sleeping in houses that felt too big and too quiet without the people who were supposed to be in them. Every morning they opened the newspaper and read the casualty lists with the specific dread of someone who has a name in the service. Not hoping for good news, just hoping their particular name wasn't on that particular list today. The anxiety was ambient. It was in the air the way humidity is in the air, not something you notice consciously, but something that changed the texture of everything. That made the ordinary slightly heavier. That sat in the back of your chest when you lay down to sleep at night. Mattoon had a war plant. The Atlas Imperial Diesel Engine Company had converted its production lines to manufacture shell casings for the army, and it ran around the clock on the edge of the city. Other industrial facilities in the region were also running at wartime capacity, with the kind of minimal emissions oversight that wartime production demands. The smell of industry was part of daily life in Mattoon, a background note that residents had learned to live with and tune out. On certain nights, depending on the wind, the fumes from one plant or another would drift through open windows in the residential neighborhoods. People noticed and said nothing, because that was just how things smelled now. But beyond the industrial fumes, something else was in the air that late summer, something less chemical and harder to measure. For months, American newspapers had been running stories about the possibility that Germany might use chemical weapons in a last desperate attempt to turn the tide of the war. Poison gas, the nightmare weapon of the First World War, the thing that had sent a generation of soldiers home with destroyed lungs and eyes that would never quite work right again, was a fear that had never entirely gone away. The government had stockpiled chemical weapons of its own as a deterrent. Civil defense programs had issued gas mask instructions to civilian populations. The subject was in the newsreels at the movie theater. It was on the radio. It was in the conversations at the diner and the church hall and the factory break room. Not a screaming headline fear, but a low, persistent hum of it underneath everything. On August 30th, just 2 days before the first Mattoon incident, the neighboring Charleston Daily Courier ran a United Press wire story warning that Germany might be developing a mystery chemical weapon as a final, desperate play. The story ran and was, on the surface, forgotten, but it wasn't entirely gone. It had lodged somewhere in the back of the mind, the way those stories do. And then there was the escaped prisoner. A week or so before Alan Carney smelled something in her bedroom, the local papers had reported that a German prisoner of war had escaped from a camp near Peoria, Illinois. He had not yet been recaptured. This was the kind of story that moved through a small city, the way local news always moves person to person, at the grocery store and the beauty parlor and the back fence, a Nazi on the loose, in the state. Now sit with all of that for a moment. You are Aline Carney. Your husband is not home. You have a 3-year-old in the bed beside you. You have been reading the same newspaper that has been warning you for months about German gas weapons. That same newspaper told you last week about the escaped Nazi prisoner. Your windows are open. You smell something sweet and chemical that you cannot identify, and then you cannot move your legs. What story does your brain tell you? When the Journal-Gazette ran its headline the next morning, it was not inventing a story. It was naming something that already existed in the minds of its readers, a fear that was already fully formed, already specific, already pointed at a target. The headline gave that fear a confirmation. It told the entire city, yes, this is real, and it is happening here, and it could happen to you. The story was picked up by the wire services within days. The Associated Press ran it, national papers picked it up. Time magazine ran a piece on what it called the mad anesthetist of Mattoon, and the reports of gas attacks in Mattoon began to multiply at a pace that no amount of police resources could keep up with. ACT-2, the gassings. The night that made the newspapers was September 1st, but the Mattoon case actually begins the night before that. On the evening of August 31st, a man named Urban Rafe woke in his house, feeling violently ill. He smelled something sweet, he said, and wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. He asked his wife if she had left the gas stove on. When she tried to get out of bed to check, she couldn't move. She lay there, unable to get up, while her husband stumbled around the house trying to figure out what was happening. Within 30 minutes, both of them were fine. They assumed a gas leak. They didn't call anyone. They went back to sleep. After the Carney headline ran, Rafe came forward. Suddenly, there were 2 incidents on consecutive nights. Similar symptoms, houses not far apart. The police had a pattern. The newspaper had confirmation, that this wasn't a single strange event. And the people of Mattoon had two data points that told them what the headline had already implied. This was real, it was happening, and it could reach anyone. By the morning of September 5th, the police department had received reports of 4 more gas attacks, 4 households, 4 sets of victims, 3 days. The details in each case were, as one officer noted with visible unease, remarkably similar, even though, as far as anyone could determine, the witnesses had not compared notes or read each other's accounts before reporting their own. Let's stay with some of these people, because they deserve more than a list. They are real people who experienced something real in their own homes, in the middle of ordinary nights, and what they experienced was frightening enough to make them pick up the phone and call the police. Mrs. Beulah Cordes came home one evening to find a white cloth lying on her front porch. It was not hers. She had no idea how it had gotten there. She picked it up and smelled it out of curiosity. The effect was almost immediate, a sweet chemical smell, and then her throat closing and her lips going numb. She dropped the cloth and went inside. Within the hour, she was nauseated and weak. Her husband picked up the same cloth later that evening, smelled it, and felt nothing whatsoever. The police collected the cloth and had it tested. No chemical compound was ever identified in it. Mrs. Violet Driscoll and her daughter Ramona woke one night to a sound outside their bedroom window, the deliberate, methodical sound of someone working at the storm sash. They got up to see what was happening. As Ramona crossed the room toward the window, a wave of nausea hit her so suddenly and severely that she began vomiting on the spot. Violet smelled the sweetness just before she reached the glass. They ran outside. Both recovered within an hour. The police found no one. They found nothing. A woman named Mrs. George Ryder reported that she woke in the night to the smell and found herself completely unable to move her legs. Her husband was lying beside her in the same bed. He smelled nothing. He had no symptoms. She was paralyzed. He was fine. 30 minutes later, so was she. The police examined the window, the yard, the alley behind the house. Nothing. A couple on the north side of town reported being hit simultaneously, the smell, then nausea, then weakness in the limbs on a night when the windows had been open for only a short time. They recovered completely. No physical evidence was found. Across all of the reported cases, the symptoms followed a pattern so consistent it read almost like a clinical profile. A sweet, heavy smell, described variously as floral, chemical, like cheap perfume over something rotten, then nausea, then a dryness and tightening in the throat, a numbness or burning sensation in the lips, then, in many cases, temporary paralysis of the legs that resolved without any treatment within 30 to 60 minutes. No one died. No one was hospitalized with serious or lasting injury. But the symptoms were real, the fear was real, and the people experiencing them were not making it up. And the figure kept being reported. Tall, thin, dark clothing, a tight-fitting cap, black or dark blue, moving quickly through backyards and alleys, always at the edge of visibility, always glimpsed and gone before anyone could get a clear look. Some witnesses described a device, a flit gun, the kind of pump-action sprayer used to apply pesticide carried in one hand. Some said they heard it before they smelled anything, a mechanical sound, something being pressurized and released. Some said they heard footsteps in the alley after the smell faded. None of it ever led anywhere. The police were overwhelmed. Chief Eugene Cole was a careful man who had reservations about the gas attacker theory almost from the start. His investigators found no chemical residue at any scene, no delivery mechanism, no physical evidence of tampering at any window. The symptoms resolved too quickly and too completely for most known toxic agents. Something wasn't adding up, but he could not simply dismiss 30-plus reports. from 30-plus people who were all clearly frightened and all describing experiences that, on the surface, were strikingly similar. The authorities escalated. 10 Illinois state police officers were assigned to Mattoon. 2 FBI agents came from Springfield. Army chemical warfare experts arrived to test the air and compare the reported symptoms against known agents. The mayor of Mattoon got involved. The Illinois Bureau of Criminal Investigation sent its superintendent. The Atlas Imperial plant was inspected. Theories were proposed and discarded. An escaped lunatic with a chemistry obsession, a German saboteur testing a weapon, a local eccentric with a grievance, anyone, with a motive and the means. The Army experts worked through the list of chemical compounds that matched the symptom profile and the described smell. Their best candidate was chloropicrin, a compound with a sweetish odor used in pest extermination, known from the First World War as a choking agent. But when they tested for it, they found nothing, and the symptoms were wrong. Chloropicrin caused severe eye irritation, intense tearing, respiratory distress that was hard to miss. Almost none of the Mattoon victims reported significant eye symptoms. The fit was poor. Meanwhile, the city was coming apart at the seams in the way that only a small city can, where everyone knows everyone, where fear spreads the way gossip spreads, where trust is intimate and therefore more fragile. Vigilante groups formed without authorization or coordination. Men with shotguns and deer rifles gathered after dark and patrolled the neighborhoods, looking for the thin figure in the dark cap. Police Chief Cole had to issue a public warning that these armed groups were in grave danger of shooting each other or an innocent bystander, and they needed to stand down. They largely ignored him. A citizens' vigilance committee organized formally. A group of businessmen announced a mass protest rally, demanding that the police take stronger action to protect the public. An editorial in the Journal-Gazette, the same paper that had started all of this, criticized the department for not doing enough. The political pressure on Cole and the mayor was intense, daily, and deeply personal. On September 8th, 1 week after the Kearney incident, the worst night of the crisis arrived. Reports came in from multiple locations across the city simultaneously. Police were running from address to address trying to respond. Reporters from the Journal-Gazette were showing up at scenes before the squad cars because people had learned to call the newspaper first. The paper was running front-page coverage every single day now, complete with maps showing where the attacks had occurred, photographs of the victims, quotes that made the invisible threat feel immediate and personal. There is a detail from this period that deserves a moment of attention because it says something about the texture of fear in Mattoon during those 2 weeks. One of the reported attacks was traced, after the fact, to a bottle of nail polish that had been accidentally knocked over in a bedroom. The smell, acetone, chemical, sweet, in the particular way of nail polish remover, had drifted through the room while the woman was sleeping. She woke up feeling nauseous and strange. She had read the newspaper that morning. She knew what the symptoms were supposed to feel like, and so she called the police. This is not a story about a foolish woman. It is a story about what happens to perception when fear has been running at high voltage for long enough. An ordinary smell in ordinary circumstances gets identified as an ordinary smell. The same smell in a community that has been told for 2 weeks that a prowler is gassing houses in the night gets identified as something else entirely. The nose doesn't change. The context does. And context, it turns out, is almost everything. And then, on September 12th, Police Chief Cole called a press conference. He said carefully and directly that the investigation had produced no evidence of a gas attacker. He explained how wind shifts at night could carry industrial fumes from local plants through open windows, accounting for some of the reported smells and some of the milder symptoms. And he said what he had been thinking for days and had not yet said publicly, that many of the reported attacks were almost certainly the result of hysteria. That the constant newspaper coverage had created a climate of fear so intense, so pervasive, that people were interpreting ordinary smells and ordinary physical sensations as attacks, that the fear itself had become the agent. The city's public health commissioner, Dr. Thomas Wright, backed him publicly. Wright was quoted in the papers saying, "The whole town is sick with hysteria." The reports stopped. Within days of that announcement, the calls dried up almost completely. A few stragglers came in over the following week, and then silence. No arrest, no identified gas, no culprit, no explanation that satisfied everyone. The thin man in the dark cap walked out of the story the same way he had walked into it, without leaving a single thing behind. Act 3. Aftermath. What was the Mad Gasser of Mattoon? The Mattoon case did not disappear when the newspapers moved on. It found its way into academic literature almost immediately. In 1945, a University of Illinois psychology graduate student named Donald Johnson traveled to Mattoon and spent weeks interviewing witnesses, reviewing police records, and analyzing the full pattern of reports. What he produced became a paper published in the Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology, one of the first scientific analyses of what we now call mass psychogenic illness ever conducted in an American context. Johnson's paper has been cited in psychology and sociology textbooks for the 8 decades since its publication. In the vocabulary of academic case studies, it is a classic. His conclusion was unambiguous. The Mattoon gassings were a textbook case of mass hysteria, a phenomenon in which genuine physical symptoms spread through a community via psychological and social mechanisms, rather than through any chemical agent. The symptoms were real. The people who experienced them were not lying or exaggerating, but the cause was not a man with a flit gun. The cause was fear, operating in a community that had every conceivable reason to be afraid. Johnson identified the factors that made Mattoon uniquely vulnerable: the sustained wartime anxiety, the specific fear of chemical weapons that had been fed by months of newspaper coverage, the industrial smells that were already part of daily life and provided a ready-made, ambiguous stimulus, something unidentifiable and slightly wrong in the air that a frightened community could interpret as an attack. The newspaper headline that named and legitimized the threat and the demographics of the victims. That last point is important and deserves care. Johnson noted that the reports of gas attacks were overwhelmingly concentrated among women, specifically women who were home alone at night while their husbands were at work or away at war. It is easy to read that observation as a coded judgment, as if the women of Mattoon were more susceptible to hysteria than men would have been, as if being female was itself the vulnerability. That reading would be wrong and it would be unfair. What Johnson was identifying was circumstance, not character. The women of Mattoon in September of 1944 were carrying an extraordinary weight. They were managing everything alone. They were responsible for the children sleeping in the next room. They did not have a partner to say, "Go check the window to," or to roll over and ask, "Do you smell that?" They lay in the dark by themselves, in houses that were quieter than they should have been, in a city that was telling them every morning that a predator was working their neighborhood. That their bodies responded physiologically to that level of sustained, solitary, fully justified fear is not weakness. It is the human nervous system performing exactly as designed. Johnson's mass hysteria explanation became the official consensus and held largely unchallenged for decades. But the story did not stay simple. In 2003, a chemistry teacher named Scott Maruna published a book called The Mad Gasser of Mattoon, Dispelling the Hysteria. Maruna had grown up in the area and had always felt that the mass hysteria explanation was too tidy, too convenient, too much the kind of explanation that officials adopt when they need a way to end a crisis without admitting they couldn't solve it. He went back through the evidence with the eye of someone trained in chemistry and the patience of someone who had been thinking about this for years. His suspect was a man named Farley Llewellyn. Llewellyn was a Mattoon resident with a chemistry degree from the University of Illinois. He was tall and thin, matching the description Bert Kearney had given of the figure outside the window. He was deeply socially isolated, the subject of neighborhood gossip, and, according to Maruna, quiet community contempt. He had a home chemistry laboratory in which he conducted experiments that his neighbors found alarming. Those experiments had once caused a small explosion that rattled windows on his street. He was the kind of man that a small city generates, an eccentric, a misfit, someone whose strangeness had over the years curdled into something that the gossip mill had decided was sinister. Whether the gossip was right or wrong is a different question. Maruna's theory is genuinely interesting. It is also not provable, and it has its own significant problems. If a single person was carrying out gas attacks at dozens of separate locations across a city over 2 weeks at night, while armed patrols actively hunted him, without ever being caught, without leaving recoverable chemical evidence at a single scene, without causing any victim serious lasting harm that requires an almost implausible combination of technical precision, physical agility, and sheer luck. It requires believing that Farley Llewellyn was simultaneously more capable, more careful, and more sophisticated than any of his neighbors had given him credit for. Possible, but asking a great deal. The third explanation is the most prosaic and, for the earliest cases, the most convincing. Industrial pollution. The Atlas Imperial plant and other facilities around Mattoon were running at wartime capacity, with minimal emissions oversight. On certain nights, at certain wind angles and atmospheric conditions, fumes from those operations drifted through open windows in the residential neighborhoods between the plants and the city center. Compounds like carbon tetrachloride and trichloroethylene, both in industrial use in the area, both with sweetish odors, both capable of causing mild transient symptoms at low concentrations, could plausibly account for the first few incidents. Urban Rafe on August 31st, Aline Carney on September 1st, the early cases from the neighborhoods closest to the industrial district. This explanation does not account for the figure in the dark. It does not fully account for the wet cloth on Beulah Cortez's porch. It does not explain the sound of someone working at a window latch in the night. But it may not need to. Those details may be exactly the kind of anxious misinterpretation that a community in a state of high alert reliably produces. A shadow in the yard becomes a figure. A branch scraping a storm sash becomes a prowler at the window. A cloth left behind by a neighbor becomes evidence of attack. Fear does not invent things from nothing. It transforms the ambiguous into the certain. So, what actually happened in Mattoon in September of 1944? Here is the most honest answer available to us, 80 years later. We don't know with certainty, but we can say this. Something real started it. Whether that something was industrial fumes drifting on the night air, a disturbed individual with a chemistry degree and a home laboratory and a grievance, or the convergence of an unfamiliar smell, with a population already stretched past its capacity for calm, something produced genuine symptoms in real people who had no reason to invent them. And then the newspaper headline happened, and after the headline, the thing that turned a local incident into a 2-week crisis, consuming the resources of the FBI and the Army and the state police, was not a chemical agent, it was fear. The specific, contagious, physiologically active fear of a wartime community that had been told by a source it trusted that a predator was in its streets. The people of Mattoon in September of 44 were not weak. They were not foolish. They were exhausted and isolated and frightened in ways that anyone living under the conditions of that war, in that year, in that place, had every reason to be. When their bodies produced the paralysis and the nausea and the burning in the lips, Those bodies were doing what bodies do under sustained, legitimate threat. They were responding to danger. The question of whether the danger was precisely what they believed it was is almost beside the point. The fear was real. The response was real. Donald Johnson was not dismissing the people of Mattoon when he called it hysteria. He was describing, with the precision available to him in 1945, a phenomenon that we now understand much better than he did and that we have documented dozens of times since in schools and factories and military units and communities around the world. Mass psychogenic illness is not a moral failing. It is a human vulnerability. The fact that it has a name and a mechanism does not make the suffering it produces less real. It makes it more explicable and more human. Farley Llewellyn went to his grave without ever being charged with anything. He lived out his life in Mattoon, quietly, or as quietly as a man can live who is the subject of neighborhood suspicion and amateur detective attention. Whether he gassed his neighbors in a campaign of chemical revenge, whether he was simply an eccentric who matched a description at the worst possible moment in his town's history, or whether he was something else entirely, we do not and cannot know. The thin man in the dark cap was never identified. The sweet smell that paralyzed Aline Kearney's legs on that warm September night was never definitively explained. And Mattoon went on. The war ended the following year. The men came home. The factories converted back to peacetime production. The Journal-Gazette found other front pages to fill, other stories to tell. The city returned to being ordinary, the railroad town, the agricultural hub, the place with the front porches and the church suppers and the Woolworths downtown. The Mad Gasser became local lore, the kind of story people told at the diner, the kind of thing you mentioned if someone from out of town asked what Mattoon was known for. It became strange in retrospect in the way that all genuine strangeness eventually becomes a story to be told and retold until it sat more comfortably in the memory than it had in the living. Donald Johnson's 1945 paper on the Mattoon case was reprinted and cited so many times in the decades that followed that the incident became a fixed point in the academic literature on mass psychogenic illness. A reference point, a touchstone, a case that every student of the phenomenon eventually encountered. It sits alongside the dancing plague of 1518, the Salem witch trials, and dozens of more recent school and factory outbreaks as evidence of something that human beings have apparently always been capable of doing to themselves and to each other when the conditions are right. The list is long. The pattern is consistent. The lesson, if there is one, is that communities under sustained pressure are not merely psychologically vulnerable in some abstract sense. They are physiologically vulnerable, capable of generating genuine symptoms in genuine bodies through genuine fear, with no external agent required. But some of the women who lay awake in September of 44 alone in the dark, windows open, listening for a sound at the screen, smelling the air, before they let themselves fall asleep, carried something from that autumn for the rest of their lives. Not a wound exactly, more like a sensitivity. The knowledge, learned once by the body and not easily unlearned, that the air in your own bedroom can become a thing to be afraid of. That knowledge doesn't leave easily. That's what Strange Epochs is. Stories that have no clean endings. Moments that history recorded but never quite explained. Events that happened, undeniably happened, and yet still somehow feel impossible. Everything you heard in this episode is real. Every name, every date, every detail drawn from documented historical sources. All of the sources for this episode are listed in the episode description below. I encourage you to look them up. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow Strange Epochs wherever you listen. New episodes drop every Tuesday. And if you want to help the show grow, leaving a review goes a long way. It really does. I'll see you next week. I'm Sean Spainhour. This is Strange Epochs.